Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, What You Need to Know About ISO 27001-2022. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You may have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. LRQA will share a recording of the webinar with everyone who has registered in the next couple of days. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to the presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Any questions that we do not have time to answer during the session will be responded to after the webinar. For your information, we will be running some live polls today, so please note that the responses are anonymous and the results will only be shared as a % result. It is my pleasure to introduce your speakers for today. Rob Acker, ICT Technical Manager at LRQA, Katerina Liana, Lead Certification Specialist at LRQA, Dan Horn, Business Assurance Consultant at Fraser Nash, and David Cooper, Cyber Risk and Assurance Manager at Fraser Nash. Rob Acker has over 35 years of experience in software development and information security management systems. Since 2007, he has served as ICT Technical Manager and Lead Auditor for LRQA. He has extensive technical experience in information system quality, security, and business continuity, as well as conducting business assurance assessments of customers' management systems. Katerina Liana has been with LRQA for 17 years and within the certification industry for 32 years. She is the America's Lead Certification Specialist and the America's Subject Matter Expert for Cybersecurity. Katerina is a lead assessor for several management system standards, including ISO IEC 27001, information security management systems, and other cybersecurity standards such as ISO 27701, ISO 27017, and ISO 2018. Dan Horn, Business Assurance Consultant, has worked for Fraser Nash since 2019. Dan has over 15 years experience in business process governance, analysis, and improvement. Dan's primary focus is making use of modern technology to create more efficient management systems and better analyze process performance. David Cooper, Cyber Risk and Assurance Manager, has worked for Fraser Nash for over 25 years, starting as IT manager. As the company went from 70 employees to 1,000, David took a more specialist role in developing the security aspects of the IT system. Recently, David has stepped out of the IT team to take on a business assurance role around cybersecurity. We'd like to now start with one of our polls. And this is a reminder that the responses are anonymous and the results will only be shared as a % result. Our first poll question is, will your organization be looking for any of the following services in the next 12 months? ISO 27001 transition from 2013 to 2022 version. Are you transitioning training? You're looking at gap analysis, certification, or non-transition training? So if you go ahead and take a moment and just make a selection, we'll then share the results with you. All right, so the majority of you have picked that you're transitioning from 2013 to the 2022 version. We have 28% looking at a certification, and last but not least, a non-transition training for 2% of you. And now I'm going to hand this over to Rob Acker to get us started with our first session.
Thank you, Trudy, and welcome everyone to this LRQA seminar on 27001-2022. See from the polls that the vast majority of you are interested in the transition, so hopefully over the next hour we'll be able to answer the majority of your questions, but there is our website to contact if that's not possible. But I see also that a few people are also interested in certification. So I thought I'd start by just saying a little bit for any people new to ISO 27001, a little bit about the benefits of 27001 certification. So let's make a start. So for anyone interested in information security, then ISO 27001 is the core management system. It's internationally recognized and a critical tool for those who want to protect the information assets that they are processing. And primarily its benefits therefore are around providing confidence, trust to your customers and other people that are working with yourselves, and achieving those high-level business objectives. It's a great way of integrating information security into your wider management and operational processes, and helps, I think, through whether it's training or management processes, to ensure that everybody is pulling together in order to provide that maximum confidence in the preserving of confidentiality, integrity and availability for the assets that you're processing. It also, and really importantly, helps you demonstrate that you're doing everything you can to maintain legal or regulatory or contractual compliance. And so it's a great tool, and because it is embedded around the continual improvement cycle, it helps you scale as your organization evolves and grows. So what does an information security management system look like? I mean, there are multiple ways of seeing this, but here's a hopefully fairly simple schematic. So broadly speaking, you want to start with looking at your context, who the interested parties are, and that will cover a wide range of internal and external participants, what their requirements are, and that's going to vary from their role to the information that they are processing, as well as increasingly a lot of sort of compliance requirements, both internal and external. That then, through engaging your leaders and managers, enables you to identify risks and opportunities and create what is at the heart of a good information security management system. Because understanding those risks and opportunities enables you to determine what your risk treatment plan is going to be, and that risk treatment plan is typically based on the best practice standards. Now, we're going to talk today about 27001 2022, but as you can see, there's a variety of other sources that you can draw on, both in the 27000 family as well as perhaps the NIST standards in America, for example, as alternatives. Having implemented all of those, then you evaluate how effectively they're doing in terms of managing your risks, and that takes you back round the cycle again, as I say, in terms of continual improvement and how you evolve as the organization evolves. So in terms of what has changed with the latest revision, we've been, I suppose, working with 27001 2013, obviously for the best part of 10 years, but it's been time to refresh and modernize as the threat and vulnerability landscape has evolved. And if we think of the standard in two parts, we've got the core continual improvement cycle, and then, as I suggested on the previous slide, we've got the control set, the best practice. In terms of the core, there are a few changes, but nothing significant to affect that continual improvement cycle. I'll say a few more things about control objectives, and there's a little bit around ensuring that changes are planned, but I think these would be things that most organizations are familiar with and probably already have in place anyway. The focus really of the change this time is on the control set. As I say, there's an element of modernization and an element of rationalization. So we've gone from 114 controls down to 93. And they're spread across the 4 themes rather than the sort of 11 control areas that perhaps you're more familiar with. At the end of the day, it all comes down to how you implement your risk treatment plan and use those control objectives. And that's what we see at the heart of this change. So I'll say a few more words about that in a minute. So as I said from my earlier slide, at the heart of the system is a risk assessment. And so we've got some new controls. What does that mean? Well, let's go back to our risk assessment. Let's identify and analyze and recheck that those risks are still valid. Let's revisit the risk treatment, and then let's compare that to the new Annex A and check whether we've missed anything. And that's where perhaps the new controls, the changed controls, are going to have their greatest impact. Then update or create the statement of applicability, that list which says what you do in order to treat your controls, update your risk treatment plan, and then importantly get your risk owner's approval. Now, I mentioned that one of the changes in the core part of the system is the removal of control objectives. Now, all management systems need to have objectives. That's how we know that they're working effectively, and 27001 is no different. I'm sure you've all got your secure high-level security objectives. But in my experience, many people were using the control objectives as a way of judging effectiveness. We certainly use that when we're doing our audits. And so given that these have been withdrawn with the new version, it's time perhaps to consider whether they still have a part to play. So we'll be looking at how you've considered that. Clearly, examples like ensuring teleworking and the use of mobile devices are still very relevant. And so they may well continue to play a part in your management system. But I would suggest that as we're seeing that new and changed controls have happened, maybe some of the old control objectives are no longer relevant. And that would be a way of refreshing your management system. Let's not forget that ultimately it's about monitoring the effectiveness of that, and how you do it is what we'll be looking for. I mentioned that statement of applicability remains a key part of the documented management system and a key part of our audits. Clearly, with a changing control set, there'll be the opportunity to refresh and review your statement of applicability. So in principle, we still expect it to be there. We will expect you to demonstrate how you've reviewed it and updated it and justified the inclusion or the exclusion of the controls, whether that's the new ones or the amended ones. And so let's just think a little moment about what a transition audit itself is going to look like. So as I hopefully have made the message, we're expecting you to look at your risk assessment, go back to that core heart of the system, make sure that you've thought about the risk treatment and what it means to your statement of applicability. Make sure that you've looked at the justification for the selection or the non-selection of the controls, and we will look at that justification and make sure we understand and potentially challenged it to make sure it's clear and it's going to form a good basis of how your management system will operate going forward. Where you've selected and implemented any of the new controls, we'll make sure that we've got time to audit their design and how they're benefiting the management system and the implementation and how you're evaluating the effectiveness of that implementation. And then depending on time, we will look at what you've done with the merged controls. And generally speaking, my advice as the technical manager here at LRQA to my auditor colleagues is to focus on those with either the highest inherent risk or the highest residual risk, and make sure that we are helping you to judge the effectiveness of your management system by focusing in those areas. Clearly, we need to know when this takes place, and the IAF have indicated that as of the date of publication, 25th of October, we collectively have 3 years to implement the change. We're working with our accreditation bodies and expect to be accredited in the next couple of months, but for all accreditation bodies, we're charged with achieving that within 12 months. And you'll notice that any 27001 2013 certificate issued from now onwards will have an expiry date of the 31st of October 2025 on that, to make sure we stay within that 3-year time frame. Hopefully I've given you a feel for what the transition audit is going to look like, but perhaps one extra thing to bring out there is we expect organisations to have carried out their own gap analysis and to understand what changes mean for them. I've given you a feel for what we expect to look at, but at the end of the day, this is your management system, and so it's your opportunity to revisit it against the new standard. And we will check what you've done there. Just to avoid doubt, an audit can be done remotely. It can be done in conjunction with the surveillance visit or at a renewal visit, but the IAF mandates that we include extra time to focus on that. So expect typically a 1-day transition audit. In which case, I'll hand back to Trudy for the next poll question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Rob. I appreciate that. And before we move on to the poll question, I just want to remind everybody that you can submit your questions through the questions pane, and feel free to do that at any time. So yes, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. And the question is, what is your organization's approach to integrated management systems? Do you already have an IMS that includes ISO 27001? Do you already have an IMS and would you like to add ISO 27001? Will you be integrating your management systems in the next 12 months? Or you don't currently plan to integrate? And lastly, are we not currently certified for either ISO 9001, 14001, or 45001? Please take a moment and make your selections, and we'll take a look at the results shortly. Great. I'm going to share the results, and it looks like 70% of you already have an IMS that includes ISO 27001. Excellent. 10% don't plan to integrate their management systems. 4% would like to integrate and add 27001, and then 9% are not certified for either of those. Okay. Thank you for those results. Well, let's go ahead and move to our next session. And I will be handing the control over to Katerina to present. Go ahead, Katerina.
Thank you, Trudy, and welcome to everybody from my side as well. As Rob briefly mentioned before, we do have some changes in the security control set in the annex of the new version of the standard. He already said that before we had 14 domains of controls. These are now grouped into 4 themes, as they are called. The total number of controls has also been reduced. We had 114 controls in the 2013 version. Now they've gone down to 93, and out of those 90 controls, 11 are totally new. When somebody looks at the controls, the description in the new version of the standard is a bit more comprehensive. Controls seem to be a bit more robust than they were before, and they help you address all these new and sophisticated risks that have emerged in the cybersecurity world. And and they also support you with business continuity and help you become more vigilant. Here you can see just a link between the themes, controls, and attributes, which is something new that has been introduced in the guidance document, which I won't be focusing on a lot. It is quite a useful document, and I strongly suggest that you take a look at it when you're looking at either transitioning or developing your management system based on 27001. Looking at the way that controls are grouped now, it makes a little bit more sense under these 4 themes that have to do with our organization, people, physical controls, or technological controls that were scattered across the 14 domains before, making them a bit more cumbersome. It's now more logical and versatile. And I think that this has helped the standard become a little bit more user-friendly and making allocation of responsibilities for controls a bit more easier for clients as they implement their information security management system. Now, looking at the new control set, we have some controls that have been merged, some controls that have been simplified, some controls that have been reduced. For example, if we look at asset management, previously we had a total number of 10 controls. They've been reduced to 6. Anything that has to do with policies has been grouped into one generic one that has to do with policies. All media-related controls have been grouped under a specific control called storage media. And that has helped with avoidance of overlapping in the standard. In some cases, you might need to reconsider responsibilities because there might be shared responsibilities. For example, a policy that's issued and owned by HR, which has to do with onboarding of new employees, from an information security perspective, could be implemented through a technological control that's introduced by your IT department. So there we have a shared responsibilities. For companies that are already certified, that means that you might need to tweak your existing controls when you're looking at your management system and adapting it to the requirements of the new version. Now, looking at the new controls, the majority of these controls fall under 3 of the 4 themes. Some of them might seem similar to controls that existed in the 2013 version, and some of them might not seem new to you because you might have been addressing them already, but they were not actually stated as controls in the 2013 version. I think that the majority of these new controls have been introduced for a number of reasons. The rapidly changing environment in cybersecurity, we've had quite a number of attacks and actually an increase in cyber attacks over the past few years. There's an evolving and growing regulatory framework on data privacy. Working from home has changed things as well. Companies are using cloud services more and more. They're becoming more digital, so there are new threats and risks out there. And overall, the necessity to be able to detect and prevent potential attacks from happening and having robust controls and measures to be able to respond to them. The new version places a lot of emphasis on cyber attack prevention and protection of sensitive data. You're facing new evolving security challenges. So let's take a look at a couple of the new controls that have been introduced. Cloud services. More and more companies are using this, and you need to consider how to better protect your information in the cloud. Things to think about: how you select your cloud provider, what type of agreement you have in place, and what requirements are in this agreement. What is your process for upgrading existing cloud services or replacing your cloud service provider with another one? If you do change provider of services, how you're making sure that you don't leave any information back with the old provider, what type of policies you have in place for acceptable use of cloud services. And things to consider always with any new control is training of employees, making sure that they're trained on the use of security features of cloud services and the security risks related to cloud services. That is quite essential and critical. The next new control we'll be focusing on has to do with threat intelligence, and this has to do with how you gather information on attacks that are happening, attacks that you might have had in the company. What type of methodologies do attackers use? What are these attacks? What sources are you going to use to gather this information? There are a lot of governmental sources out there, various agencies that put out information on attacks and the outcome and the type of attacks as well. You can look at supplier reports, industry announcements as well. And this has to do with mainly making good use of this information to be more proactive. There's a potential need for policies and operating procedures. And as always, it's quite important to raise awareness of employees. They need to know how and to whom communicate threats to, meaning that you need to have some kind of incident management process so they know how to escalate issues. And one thing you also need to keep in mind is your supply chain and partners, and how you can share this type of information with them, or how they can share this type of information with yourself, meaning that you might need to introduce some kind of supplier management policy. And the last new control we'll be looking into has to do with data leakage prevention, and what you are doing as a company to prevent unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. How can you detect this in a timely manner? What process do you have in place? And this has to do with any information that is sensitive, confidential in your IT system, your network, or various devices. What type of systems do you need to monitor leakage channels, such as email or mobile devices, or any type of removable media that might be used? What systems do you use to prevent leakage? Do you use email quarantine? Have you disabled the ability to download information on removable media? Do you use encryption? Do you have restrictions on allowing employees to copy paste data? Policies in place, operating procedures are necessary, like an information classification policy, acceptable use of media as well, which probably you do have in place if you're already certified. If you're not, these are things to consider. And as I said before, when we talked about the previous two new controls, making sure that you constantly raise awareness of your employees is quite important. What are the do's and don'ts? What type of sensitive information is managed, and how do your employees manage this? What do they have access to and what they don't? Why they shouldn't take pictures of sensitive information with their smartphones, and making them sure that they understand why preventing data leakage is quite important, as this might also have legal implications for the company. And I'll hand over to Trudy for the next poll question. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Katerina. We're now heading into our third poll, and just a reminder that the poll is anonymous, so please do answer. The poll question is, if you're planning to transition, which approach are you planning to follow? Be an early adopter? Do you want to add to a surveillance visit? A dedicated transition assessment? A certificate renewal? Or you're not sure? So take a moment and answer the question. Again, those are our choices: being an early adopter, add to surveillance, dedicated transition, certificate renewal, or you're just not sure. Okay. I have the results coming in. I'll share those with you momentarily. Got quite a race going here. Okay. So let's take a look and see what we have. 34% of you are not sure. So that's the big winner. 28% are adding to a surveillance visit, 15% early adopters, 23% certificate renewal, and 12% dedicated transition assessment. Okay, so thank you everyone for participating. I appreciate that. I'm going to now hand the controls over to our speakers from Fraser-Nash. Dan Horn and David Cooper, please go ahead.
Hello, and this is David Cooper here. I'm going to give a brief introduction to Fraser-Nash and then talk about how that feeds into our information security management system and our journey through 27001. So Fraser-Nash Consultancy traces its roots back to a chap called Archie Fraser-Nash, who was born in the late 1800s. He was in the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War and working in a defense industry in the Second World War. He started his own successful engineering business just after the war, working in defense and then in the new civil nuclear industry. In parallel with that, he also started a successful car business, or a small car business that has his name on it, which celebrated its centenary this year. Some of you may be familiar with the old Fraser-Nash cars. Today, we have just over 800 staff in the UK and about 200 in Australia, and are part of a large American organization called KBR. We continue to work in those traditional industries, in market sectors, in defense and civil nuclear. We also work in a number of other areas, including renewable energy, medical instruments, transport and industry. So quite a broad range of activities there. And we provide a range of engineering services to those market sectors. We started our journey to 27001 back in 2013, partially driven by changing requirements of MOD accreditation, as they were decided to align their requirements with 27001 2013. And we achieved certification in 2015. So when we look at our current ISMS, the market sectors and the work we do drive two of the key things of why we need a robust ISMS. Firstly, you think about threat actors. We work in sectors like defence and civil nuclear. So we attract all sorts of people from state-sponsored and foreign intelligence services right through criminals, activists, industrial espionage, you name it, we seem to interest people. You also look at that range of industries and they bring along a wide variety of compliance requirements. So as well as 27001, we need to comply with Cyber Essentials, the MOD Defence Cyber Protection Partnership Scheme, the Australian Department of Defence scheme, the Australian Essential 8, which is similar to Cyber Essentials. So these form and make for a very interesting threat assessment, our business context, and help identify a wide range of interested parties that is all needed to drive our ISMS. So I'll now hand over to Dan, who's going to give you a brief overview of what that looks like.
Thank you very much, David. So yes, as David says, we're going to take you through our information security management system model, and then we'll see how the benefits of that model allow us to cope with situations like the change of the ISO standard. So to start with, we saw on the previous slide, David was talking about the context of the business, our interested parties, and as per the standard, that drives our requirements, which help us identify our risks. And when it came to building our model, this is where the first piece of the jigsaw came in, which was identifying what are our threat sources, what are our asset groups, and making sure to really strongly categorize what those were. So a big element I'd like to put forward here is how important teamwork was in that process. So working closely with subject matter experts such as David, our colleague Neil Pryke, we identified what our different threat sources were and our different asset groups, including splitting our assets into primary assets, so the information that we're trying to protect, and then secondary assets as well, so the container of that information. Spending the time by putting those two together allowed us to really clearly identify what our risks were, assess them, and then treat them, with the treatment taking the form of our own Fraser-Nash controls. And also those controls then allowing us to meet the requirements of the standard, in particular the Annex A controls that are listed in there. And to start with, we base the Fraser-Nash controls on those Annex A requirements, in fact, identically to them. But as David alluded to, we actually have to deal with a lot of other standards, and that's where we started to run into difficulties with only having those as the controls, because then effectively you're repeating it each time you do a new standard, you're writing new statements for those. So we've started evolving those Fraser-Nash controls to better match what we as a business actually do. And the beauty of that then is that we can have a control that maps to various different requirements, and we're avoiding duplication of effort. And then the final piece of our model is the assessment part. So for example, when it comes to our controls, we would do maturity assessments of those controls. How well are they performing? What are they telling us about our risk profile? And then gathering other data in the business, such as security events and incidents, and using those threat and asset sets that we saw or we talked about earlier to analyze how well we're doing. So the next step then was taking this from a theoretical model into something that we could actually manage on a day-to-day basis. So to do that, we very quickly identified we need an electronic solution. And as you can see from the complexity of the map, spreadsheets wasn't going to handle it. And we weren't at a position where we thought we could use an off-the-shelf product. We took advantage of the technology the business had already invested in. So that's your Microsoft tools, your SharePoint, your Power Apps, your Power BI. And you're just seeing here a collection of some of those tools that we use in the business. So starting in the top left, we've got our tool for statement of applicability, where we identify what a Fraser-Nash control is, and then we map that to the different requirements. So you can see here ISO 27001 or Cyber Essentials. Then the next tool that we've got here is our risk assessment tool. So again, from the model, we identify what's the threat source for that risk, which asset is it targeting, which primary asset information is it targeting, and what impact's that going to have on our risk profile, and what mitigating controls have we got in there to be able to mitigate that risk, and how well are they performing. And then, of course, we can do the assessment of the risk as well. Finally, at the bottom, by storing this information in the SharePoint site that sits behind our Power Apps tools. We can then use Microsoft Power BI to analyze that data, look for trends. So for example, for a combination of threat and assets, how many security events and incidents are we seeing for that? Have we set our risk profile correct accordingly? If we're seeing a lot of events and incidents, do we need to increase that probability? We can also as well see what controls are mitigating that risk. Have we scored those appropriately? And then it comes around to, well, how does this help us with the ISO 27001 changes? So the key part here is, having done those Fraser-Nash controls, rather than starting from scratch with a new standard, we can do, as Rob and Katerina alluded to earlier, things like gap analysis. So we can actually look at our Fraser-Nash controls and say, well, how well do they meet the new standard? In cases where they match perfectly, we can then formalize that relationship using the tool we showed earlier by mapping this Fraser-Nash control to those parts of Annex A that it covers. Where we're seeing minor differences, hopefully that's something we can handle quite quickly, make a small update to the control statement, check that that's accurate, and again, map that relationship. Where there are significant differences, this gives us the opportunity to either create new Fraser-Nash controls to meet that, but it also offers us some other possibilities. So for example, the option to combine existing Fraser-Nash controls, and certainly where the control set's reduced, we will be looking to do that. Or potentially even split out an existing Fraser-Nash control into more manageable parts that better meet the requirements of the standard. So the summary there is that by having our own set of Fraser-Nash controls, we can cope with the different requirements and standards that we have to deal with, including any new ones and any changes to them. So for the final part of our presentation, I'm going to hand back over to David, who's going to talk us through his commentary on the new standard.
Yeah, so just, I think, really picking up on what Dan, Katerina and Rob have previously said, just looking at some of the work that we've done so far. So first step, we've completed an initial gap analysis of the new Annex A and against our Fraser-Nash controls. And I think our initial view is very positive. I think first and foremost, I was saying there that the changes seem to make sense. So some of the key points there. So the 4 themes, I think, are simplified that greatly. So it helps with allocation of the controls across the right teams. So you've got a set of people controls you can go and talk to HR about, and you're talking about a single set of controls, and so it's easy to make sure they get the right ones. Likewise, the physical controls and the technology controls. When you look at the reorganization of the controls, how they have been split out or merged together, or that again, particularly in areas like asset management and access control, which have seen a number of changes. We'd already been merging together using the same Fraser-Nash control to meet a number of the 27013 controls, and when we look at the new controls in 2022 version, that they're bringing those together where we'd already thought that makes more sense to be in one description. The language that they're using is more up to date, and some of the controls they're bringing, some of the new ones that have been brought in are things like cloud, DLP, and threat assessment, which bring in things that are everyday content and requirements today. And then lastly, just wanted some of the attributes that Katerina touched on. These I think it make it a lot easier for optimizing risk treatment. For example, making sure you get a good balance across the controls that you're using. So for instance, making sure you've got a spread of preventative, detective, and corrective controls. It'll also make it easier to analyze the data that you're building up in your ISMS. Certainly something that we're looking to do moving forward is to get better. You're generating a lot of data. This will make it easier to turn it into useful information. And also starting to see other frameworks using similar attributes. They're not necessarily the same, but there is a reasonable crossover with something like the CIS framework. So again, where you've got requirements from multiple certifications, it makes it easier to cross-reference them. So I think that's all good. So I think it's something that we're looking to tackle next year and are aiming at the moment to certify to the new standard probably this time, around this time next year. So thank you very much. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Dan and David. Appreciate that. We're heading into our final poll for today, and that question is, what are your cyber risk management priorities in the next 12 months? Are you looking to protect personally identifiable information? Are you understanding IT vulnerabilities? Are you becoming more resilient to cyber threats? Or are you migrating to cloud services? Take a moment and go ahead and let us know what your management priorities are in the next 12 months. All right. Thanks everyone for participating. I appreciate it. Let's go ahead and share the results of our information. And our number one is becoming more resilient to cyber threats, and I would expect that in today's environment. Understanding IT vulnerabilities, 41%. 37% protecting personal identifiable information, and last but not least, migrating to cloud services. Great results. Thank you for those answers. I appreciate it. And we're going to go ahead and move into our Q&A session. And I'd like to remind you that you can still submit your questions. Our speakers are now going to be answering those. And as a reminder, we will follow up with you if they are not answered during our time frame. Okay, so our first question I have, this is for Rob. So Rob, what happens to my existing ISO 27001-2013 certificate?
Thanks, Trudy. And I think that probably relates to one or two of the other questions that people have submitted. So thank you for all of those questions. So for your existing 27001-2013 certificate, we need to make sure that you carry out a transition before the end of October 2025. And so in broad terms, two things will happen. Any certificate that's issued now will have an expiry date on it. And that's an expiry date for the certificate. It's not the expiry, if you like, of your management system. And I know some people think, oh, we're losing a year or something if the certificate expires in shorter than 3 years. What will happen in practice, assuming a successful transition, is that the new 2022 version of the certificate will have a new expiry date that's 3 years from your previous issued certificate. So in a sense, it's just a temporary limitation on your 2013 certificate. Hopefully that helps to clarify that point. Thanks, Trudy.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Katerina, this question is for you. Can I apply my own control measures, or do I need to apply those in Annex A of ISO 27001? I think you might be muted.
Got to unmute myself. I think there's always been freedom for companies to introduce their own control measures as long as you can demonstrate compliance with the annex of the standard. It was the same with the 2013 version. It's the same with the 2022 version. So you can introduce other type of control measures as long as you can demonstrate compliance with Annex A of the standard. So the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you. David, this question is for you. What is the biggest benefit of ISO 27001 certification for your business?
Well, I think I'd say there are probably two really important benefits. Firstly, internally, it's a way of making sure that our security practices are up to standard, and we're doing what the business requires in terms of protecting ourselves. And secondly, it's then being able to demonstrate to our clients that we are protecting their information, because predominantly the information we hold is client information. And it's really important that if we're to be trusted with that, we show that the right due care and attention.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. And Rob, how difficult will it be to transition to the new version of the standard?
Well, I think for organisations that are already well established and have a experience with 27001, it won't be that difficult. I think if you go through your risk assessment process, look at your risk treatments, consider the new sets of controls, select, implement them. I think for a lot of organisations that'll be a natural process of continuing to improve themselves. So hopefully it won't prove too difficult for most people. I know there was a question about, why is there additional time being recommended by the IAF? Well, I think it is whilst the core management system in itself hasn't changed, because of the significant number of changes to the Annex A and the need to make sure that they have been effectively justified or implemented. That's where the bulk of the time will go. And so, to come back to your question, Trudy, difficulty to some degree will be proportionate to the amount of change that you need to implement as part of your risk treatment activities.
Okay, thank you. Katarina, will the new version of ISO 27001 have an impact on my employees?
A change to 20 standard always has an impact on companies. First of all, you need to let them know that you're considering the implementation to the new standard, or if you're transitioning, that there will be changes. So additional training will be needed on the new, especially on the new controls that have been introduced. If people are involved in the implementation of the control or monitoring. As I stated before, raising awareness and constantly raising awareness is an important aspect of any management system. It's the same for information security management systems as well, because it makes employees understand how important it is to implement controls so risks and threats don't materialize. As there might be a reallocation of responsibilities or shared responsibilities, that's where additional training might come into. So that's the main impact on the employees, making sure that they're aware of the changes, that they're appropriately trained, know what to do when there's an event or an incident. So it will be.
Okay, so thank you for that one. And Dan, what would be the most challenging aspect of implementing the new version of ISO 27001?
I think probably the most challenging bit is that gap analysis we talked about. But actually, as we devoted quite a bit of time to that in the presentation, another thing that sprung to mind for me was trying to avoid making assumptions. So sometimes we'll tend to, particularly if it's a new standard, you will read that and you'll draw an assumption about what you think that control actually means, as opposed to what it's actually trying to get you to do. So I think we need to make sure we do a good job of doing that. And one way to ensure that we're doing that correctly is when we have updated our control statements, is making sure to do things like those review processes we talked about. So whether that's evaluating controls or doing internal audits, and making sure that when we do that, that's independent from the person who's perhaps rewritten the control statement. So we're taking advantage of our team and using the different knowledge that we've got.
Okay, thank you. Rob, where can I find ISO 27001 training for my team?
Thanks, Trudy. So we're putting a range of courses together. There's a couple of dedicated courses on the new standard, a half-day sort of overview course for leaders perhaps, and a 2-day auditor course for those that want to learn about how to audit against the new standard. There is a range of existing courses that we'll just sort of refresh and update, and they'll all be available through our website in due course. Thanks, Trudy.
Okay, excellent. And then Katerina, will I need to regroup my controls as per the new themes?
Not necessarily. That might mean a lot of updating in the documentation and policies, as long as Rob stated before, but I think also Dan and David, you look at your risk assessment, you look at your risk treatment plan, your statement of applicability, and introduce the new controls. You don't necessarily need to regroup. That has never been a requirement when we have changes in standards to adapt the management system to the way a standard is structured. A standard states requirements, and you adapt the the standard to your management system. So you don't have to regroup the controls into the 4 new domains. If you already have them in the grouped in the 12 that previously existed, you can rearrange if you want to, but you don't necessarily need to regroup. That would not be a requirement.
Great, that's wonderful to know. This question is for Dan. With regard to the tools highlighted, do these also manage a wider IMS, or are they solely managing the ISMS?
Yeah, this is a good question. So a lot of the tools you'd have seen specifically on there are for the information security management system, but we have a set of tools that we also use for our other management systems, so quality, health, safety, and environment. And one of the pieces we're doing is understanding where we can use a tool repeatedly. So for example, there's parts of the risk tool that we think could apply to all the management systems, but the actual creation of the risks will be quite different. So where we use those threat and asset groups, we would find that potentially safer health and safety, we're looking more at hazards. So to answer the question, it's a bit of a mix and match, but thank you very much for the question.
Okay, appreciate that. Rob, this question is for you. To clarify one more time, if certificate expires next year, will it only be renewed for 2 years until 2025 and not for 3 years?
So if your 2013 certificate expires next year, in practice, yes, you'll get a new certificate that will have an expiry date of the end of October 2025. It will look like, therefore, you've lost a year. Appreciate that. But in practice, that's not the case. So if, for sake of argument, your certificate expired on the 1st of June 2023, once we've completed the transition, your 2022 certificate will be reissued with an expiry date of the 1st of June 2026. So in effect, the 3-year cycle carries on, even though the certificate expiry dates are limited based on the standards in question. Hopefully that clarifies that point.
Yes, thank you. So we're not losing that year. Excellent. Katerina, are all Annex A controls mandatory to implement or just a list to select from? And if necessary, e.g., depending on the risk assessment results?
It depends on the risk assessment and the applicability of control. For example, if your company is a virtual company, physical security doesn't apply, so you can exclude that. Or if you don't have teleworking, it can be excluded as a control. And this needs to be indicated in your statement of applicability, and you also need to justify why the specific control is excluded. So you can exclude controls. That's always been the case with 27001. As long as you can justify it, and that needs to be included in your statement of applicability.
Okay, thank you. And Rob, this is a question that everyone always has. Will the presentation be available for viewing after this webinar?
Thanks, Trudy. Yes, absolutely. So thanks everyone for their questions. This presentation has been recorded, and we aim to make it available from our website in the next few days.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, we are about out of time, and I just want to thank you, our speakers from LRQA and Fraser Nash, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you complete that and provide your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. So on behalf of LRQA and our presenters, I want to say thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day.